Hi, I'm Jonny, not James Bond. And even though we're in Office 007, we don't have a license to kill, thankfully. Although that doesn't mean we don't have a license to thrill, entertain, or even educate. And that's the best license, especially for podcasting. Money Matters is a podcast brought to you by me and by Money Support Group. And it looks at financial hardship and personal hardship, as well as ways to counteract those difficult life moments. If you want to find out a bit more about Money Support Group, then there should be a little bit of information in the description and maybe a link to a website that you can click on. As far as I'm concerned, leading this podcast, I'd love you to like, comment and subscribe. It would mean a lot to me, and also Money Support Group and the team that supports me with Money Matters. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Money Matters podcast interview feature on YouTube, whatever you want to call it. I'm Jonny, and this week, happily joined by another Nick, this time Nick Cassidy. He's a pension expert, he's been a solicitor, he's been a football agent. There's about 250 different things. I think that's quite accurate, isn't it?
That's right, yeah, fair enough.
Any favourite one in particular? I think I know the answer, but we'll probably get to that at the end.
Well, just sort of, they didn't all come at once. So just to give a real quick background, qualified as a solicitor in 2004, and I've still got my practice certificate now and still keep my hand in, so I'm still practicing solicitor. But the company I was with also had an arm to the business where they had a football agency. So I am a football fan. I never played purely because I had zero talent, but it's the sport I always enjoyed watching the most. I became a help with the agency, and as part of that, I decided to cross-qualify as a financial advisor. So at the moment, I sort of have different hats on, but I've sort of got a foot in many camps.
Well, it's certainly good to have, particularly in the current job market, to have a finger in every pie, shall we say. I think that's quite a good way of putting it, and being very multi-talented. So you can never be too qualified, can you?
I think talented might be a stretch. Maybe multi-qualified.
Don't do yourself such a disservice. I mean, I certainly wouldn't with me. I'd be bigging myself right up to the ceiling. But no, with that resume anyway. So probably the quickest edit we've ever done in a podcast. Ironically, as I redid this edit, I got distracted myself. Someone came in to talk to Nick. Someone just came over to wave at me. I mean, this doesn't usually happen. Might happen to Nick quite regularly. You know, very popular man. To me, no, they usually turn away. When they see my face. But no, I think back to the first question. That's where we're at. So I was talking to Nick last week about the triple lock system, and I know actually before we edited this, I didn't actually explain what that was for anyone that wasn't sure. It was basically the guarantee that the basic state pension will rise by a minimum of either 2.5%, the rate of inflation, or the average earnings growth, and that's whichever is largest. So essentially, when this was put into place, this was to, I suppose, give a bit of a kickstart to the state pension, really. And recently, some people have suggested, even Rishi Sunak has suggested, maybe putting a freeze on that triple lock system, essentially, I suppose, capping or not giving more of a guarantee to the benefits that someone would have if they've been working in the system and paying into the system for a long period of time. And Nick, you have quite strong views on this, or quite focused views on this. Say you're more on the idea of keeping the triple lock. I think
I am. Perhaps it's. I think I was saying before I asked to stop. I think it's more of it's not just a finance question, is it? I think it's perhaps sort of linked to politics as well, and where you are on the spectrum. And me personally, obviously I'm a Lancastrian boy.
Are you actually? I went to that university as well, so that's fantastic.
I'm from working class roots, and the state pension, and especially for obviously when we're helping clients in terms of financial advice, the state pension is very valuable for many people. And obviously my own personal view is that if you're working or contributing to society for a long period of time, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that when you get to the age where perhaps you can't work as much, or choose not to, because obviously you've worked for many, many years, I think the population should be given some protection. I understand it's a tough balancing act for the government, and obviously I've been reading quite the information that's been coming out sort of this week. There's a number of suggestions, isn't there? You've touched upon obviously one suggestion of freezing it. There's another suggestion that obviously they use a 2-year average rather than 1 year. I think that was mentioned today, because I think the estimate is that they think this year maybe an additional 3 billion to the bill. But my default position is that it is something, if at all possible, it should be protected.
Yeah, I mean, currently a basic state pension equates to £137.60 a week, and a full state pension £179.60 a week.
Yeah,
not a lot, is it? Really,
it's not. But if you look at the size of a fund that potentially you would need to buy an annuity that sort of compares, it's not an insignificant amount, and it's an important point of financial advice that you take that into account. It's certainly not something to be scoffed at, and unfortunately, I think we're going to touch upon this in a moment or two. But sometimes people don't save in private pensions, and they're very reliant on that state pension, and if you've got nothing else to really fall back on, it can be absolutely vital.
Perfect. Yeah, perfect segue, like you just said, onto private pensions. Just before we get onto that, actually, just a really brief side note, really, just adding to that. Our UK state pension, though, again, I'm not completely 100% sure of this. I'm sure you're more informed than I am, but it doesn't compare very well with the rest of the world, does it? Or the rest of Europe, at least?
No, I think the benefit system, the state pension, the welfare systems. When you look at some of the provisions in other countries, I think many would argue that ours aren't particularly advantageous when you compare them. Off the top of my head, I can't quote exact figures, but they're quite easy to find, obviously, when you do a bit of research online and whatnot. But again, that's perhaps not just a finance issue. Perhaps that's more of a realm into the political side of it, and obviously what the priorities are for different governments at different times.
Yeah, well, I think really as we come on to private pensions now, I agree. I do think the emphasis on that does again link to your place on the political map, because of course with private pensions, for those again that maybe aren't too aware what goes on with them, it basically you often get your employer to put a percentage of your wage in. Their employers are obliged to match that. You usually get around 25% tax relief from the money that's inside or put into that private pension pot. And I guess people who are against the triple lock system would argue that if you utilize a private pension to the best effectivity that you can, then the state pension, I suppose, becomes redundant. But then on the other hand, then you've got people who are less financially savvy, or maybe aren't in as well paid jobs, for example, or aren't as good with technology, and they get thrown under the rug a little bit, don't they?
They do, and I think we discussed this slightly sort of off air and a little bit last week. Education in relation to pensions, it's perhaps only when you're sort of getting nearer to the retirement age, or when you want to retire, that you start really focusing, unfortunately, on the pensions. And I wish I'd have known at school when I was at university, and when I started my first job, the benefits, for example, of a pension, what they are, how they work, and whatnot. In an ideal world, everyone would have obviously their own private pension provision, and then obviously the state pension, as you mentioned, may be redundant. But the reality is that's simply not the case. So for me personally, again, perhaps putting a political head on, the state pension, many people rely on it. It's a really important provision that ultimately people pay for in their own working life in any event.
Sure.
I just think it's really important, and it should be protected. And nothing will. Maybe the government could look at other ways of funding sort of pension funds and private pension funds, and perhaps providing different advantages and relief, whatever it may be. But at the current state of play, many people rely on that state pension, and me personally, I think it should be protected.
Well, yeah, no, we talked about the figures just before, actually, really. I think you get the sense with the state pension that while it's important to have around, you can't use it as your sort of, I think I described it before. I've been talking to someone else about this. It's like having, I suppose, half a crutch. I mean, it will help, in later life, but without the backing, without the complementing of a private pension fund, it would be very, very difficult to live on, really.
Yeah, I don't think any financial advisor would encourage anyone purely to rely on a state pension. As an overall financial plan, but it is something to take into account. And I think sometimes also, I think people sometimes discount how sort of when you compare it in terms of the alternatives in terms of funding, for example, annuity with your own fund, how valuable it is, and sort of the liability for the government. So I understand there is that sort of pressure that it's not an insignificant amount to fund, but I don't really want to get into politics.
No.
But me personally, I just think it is something that the government were aware that it was obviously something important in terms of a vast majority of the population. I'm saying a large portion of the population.
Yeah.
Obviously, they mentioned it was a big topic in terms of the election previously.
Sure.
Now, obviously, we're in a changing world where things change from week to week and month to month, and
day
obviously
to day now, isn't it?
Day to day, and obviously, hopefully, we're coming out of the back end of a pandemic. So perhaps, this government have perhaps had sort of stresses and issues to deal with that perhaps no other government has. Well, certainly not in our living memory. So I do understand it's a balancing act, but it's just something that obviously, as a working class lad from the north, I'm just quite passionate about.
No, we do I love to hear passion. We love to hear passion, and certainly I don't think you were too political there. I think you were just putting across a very convincing argument, and I'm inclined to agree with you on your stance anyway. I was just sort of like a bit of balance, so I thought I'd throw both sides at it. Really.
Absolutely.
But yeah, no, obviously similar background to yourself, so I can fully appreciate where you were coming from there. In terms of, we touched on it again, in terms of the education point of view, and you said it when you went to university, it's the same for me. Never even thought about pensions, never really thought about finances really, although maybe budgeting did come into play a bit, particularly at university, I'll say. But then you go back to your school times, and again, this is something we touched on in our chat last week. There is so little emphasis on real world education, real world finance, say. For example, as we say, in your maths GCSE exams, your maths A level, we get lots of theorems and things to learn. And I did an A level in maths, so I should know. But it doesn't really, much of it doesn't really attribute to things you do in everyday life. You can have someone who gets an A in A level maths who comes out of college, has no idea about pensions, has no idea how to budget, has no idea, where their money goes in terms of, they don't understand finances. Is this something really that needs to change? It's not just me saying that. We've had people on here who've been saying that, really campaigning for this. I just wonder what your thoughts are on it.
I think I completely agree. I did A-level maths, and my first degree I did economics originally. And in terms of, for example, with the math, the quadratic equations and whatnot that you probably never use again. And I think economics, obviously, sort of some of the theory obviously is relevant to being a financial advisor, but some of the diagrams that you do, I don't think I ever sort of touched them since.
No.
But budgeting, finance, working out what interest is, APR, that sort of thing. I think it's a vital part of being a member of the community, a member of the working population, going into adulthood. And I can only talk from my own experience. It's just things that hopefully you pick up as you go along. But looking back now, would I have benefited in terms of having that education? Absolutely. Some of the things that I did learn that, I remember the teachers saying that, you're not going to have a calculator with you every day, but you obviously do.
You have your phone.
But in terms of budgeting and whatnot and finance and pensions, I think it should definitely be part of the curriculum. I don't know if you agree.
100% agree. It's something I think it's not just that really. I think there's so much that should be a part of the curriculum in terms of helping people cope with, as I say, the challenges and of everyday life. I mean, so many people come out and they don't understand the world around them, and I think that's really, really sad. Not only from a financial point of view, but I even think from an ethical, from a political. We don't want to go off too far on the tangent, but I do think for me, I'd be looking at a huge, huge reform and keeping it tailored to this subject. Yeah. A more financially educated population would be wonderful to see. But I can't help but think, though, Nick, and maybe I'm being a bit cynical, but if we educate people too much, and I'd be all for this, by the way, so people wouldn't like that, would they? To a point.
You can't please everyone.
No.
Yeah, no. Some people wouldn't like it, no, but I just think you look. Schools changed since I was there. Because my mum was she had a change in career and she ended up being a teaching assistant. And it changed sort of from the time I was at school, where she tells me now there are more sort of lifestyle skills. They want to make sure that the children can make their own meal and whatnot. Now, I went to an all-boys school.
I'd have done that course.
Exactly. I went to an all-boys school, and perhaps if you'd have tried to get us to sort of make meals and do home economics at that time, we perhaps wouldn't have been as keen as obviously they are now. But he told me that the children really welcomed it, and they were teaching them lifestyle skills that some of them just weren't, especially in the area that we're from, because there are some obviously deprived areas, particularly in the north. Things like learn about washing clothes and whatnot. So obviously they are skills that you're going to use in everyday life. In terms of the finance and whatnot, it's just a fact, isn't it, that it affects every day. And there's one example that sort of springs to mind. It's somebody I came across. It was someone who was in the 20s or 30s. They were on a substantial amount of money, and they didn't know what a mortgage was. Now, I found it really hard to sort of get my head around that, but it was just something that they just didn't understand. They'd never sort of had a need to read round it. And when I was having a conversation about what a mortgage is, it was quite apparent that they just had no idea. And I think it's things like that that sort of hammer it home how it would be beneficial for it definitely to be part of the curriculum. Not everyone's going to be interested in it, but I just think I think lifestyle skills and finance and other bits and bats, I think it's vital.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. I was sort of hinting at it from the perspective of maybe people who give this advice in employment from we work in a similar sector, other people work in a similar sector, and there's people who are actually out there to exploit people who don't have that understanding, which is quite abhorrent. But there's a lot of different sectors out there, I suppose, that do benefit, I suppose, from that lack of education from a young age. Now, from our point of view, I completely agree. It's something we of course love to be in. We're thankful to be in the jobs that we are. We're thankful to have had the experience with people who are to help people in financial hardship. But then when you think about people who exploit that, certainly they wouldn't want that education. I think there's a lot of exploitation, isn't there, within the world anyway. It'd be nice to cut down on that. I think that's just pretty fair.
I think in every sort of sector I've worked in, there are always going to be people that will try and exploit that vulnerable part of that community. It's just unfortunately human nature, isn't it? It's just an unfortunate trait of humankind. I don't think that will ever stop.
Nope.
Like looking at obviously we talk about finance. With finance now, obviously with the FCA and whatnot, and look at my role as a financial advisor. It's obviously regulated, and you've got to pass exams. You've got to obviously be authorised by the FCA. And from what I understand, the regulatory side of it compared to a few years ago, there's a marked difference.
Yeah.
And the main reason for that is try and protect people, isn't it? And ensure that they're not taken advantage of. And that has to be a step in the right direction. And some people may not be happy with that, might not like the regulatory side of it if they've not always done it. But ultimately, the regulatory side of it is protect the population, the community, So it just has to be a necessary consequence, doesn't it?
Absolutely. No, the FCA, they are, as an authority, as a board, they do their utmost really to protect clients and ensure, as you say, that people are not exploited in any possible way by any advice firms or people who claim to be trying to help them. In terms of just a general question, actually, on Google, really, that comes up quite a bit, and gives a quick, perfect for you to answer, really. A bit of detail, don't have to be too much. Before we move on to a slightly more interesting topic, I would say, you probably know what that is. Can you cash in pensions to pay off existing debts? Asked a lot on Google, asked a lot generally. What would you answer to that?
Obviously, in terms of it's always take regulated advice in relation to that should be a default
Good
position.
start,
but generically, as it stands, obviously, if you've got a private personal pension, when you get to 55, obviously, theoretically, you can access that pension, depending on what product it's in and whatnot. But very basic, very generically, obviously, with the pension freedoms and whatnot, everyone knows that there's the 25% tax-free cash. So that's something that obviously people can look at. And basically how you can access it, the straightforward answer is theoretically yes. And sometimes I've had friends in the past, even before I did this job, they were just waiting to get to 55 and think, fantastic, I can get my hand on my pension. They might want to pay off debt. They might want to fund a holiday and whatnot. So theoretically you can, but obviously there's just implications in relation to that. And for example, if somebody takes the tax-free cash and the remainder, what they sometimes don't appreciate is that if they just draw out the remainder, they get taxed at the marginal rate. So it's not as straightforward as thinking, I've got my pension, I'm 55, I'm going to try and access it now. And obviously there's different pension products and different rules in relation to different sorts of pensions. So yes, theoretically, but it's an area where you get regulated advice, and with good reason, because there are rules, advantages, disadvantages. So I think my advice would be get someone to advise you, and don't just jump in and try and sort of just do it ad hoc and sort of wing your way through it. There are implications in relation to that, and obviously that's why the FCA decided that you need to get regulated advice in relation to that.
Yeah, fantastic answer. Yeah, well, very well put. On to our, we'll go for our final, really general big topic as such, in terms of footballers and pensions, because as I said at the start, that you are a football agent. You do have quite a number of clients. And just before we went on to this discussion, you did say that it was quite striking to you how footballers or some people within that industry weren't very financially savvy. Care to elaborate on that, really?
Obviously, the public perception of certainly successful footballers in the Premiership, the Championship, that they earn a massive amount, and they are high wealth individuals, and they've got nothing to worry about. Some of my colleagues in relation to the sports agents that I assist with, and they are FA intermediaries. So the term agents turn to FA intermediary now. But basically, we sometimes go to conferences and whatnot where you get professionals from all walks of life coming in, advising football people from clubs, coaches, intermediaries, whatever it may be. And there's one example that really sort of sticks out to me where a well-known Premiership footballer, not one of our clients, but it was an example that was given, a well-known Premiership footballer was on thousands and thousands per week. He was a striker, so traditionally they're obviously paid a premium. And his bank manager had to phone him and say, what are you doing with your money? What do you mean? Are you saving it into a pension? No. Have you got ICE? No. Have you got anyone advising you financially? No. Well, looking at your bank balance, you are going to be bankrupt within sort of a couple of months. He said, well, what do you mean? And when they sort of got under the bonnet of it, what he was doing was he was literally just thinking that money would come in every week. So he wasn't putting any money aside for his future. He just didn't think that when he got to 35, the chances are that he's not going to be a successful manager and getting X amount per year, and potentially his income was going to drop off drastically. And when he had about 15, 20 hangers on, so he was buying them Rolexes every week and whatnot. And he was literally spending more than he was sort of earning at this stage. So obviously once he got to 35, using that as an example, probably an average age for him to retire, he was going to have zero income. He was going to have zero set aside for his future, his retirement. And I think it's something now that many of the clubs and the PFA and whatnot are quite hot on. They know it's a big topic. And I was reading an article that there's a high percentage of former footballers go bankrupt, I think, within the first 3 to 5 years of retiring from playing. So yeah, talk about education. I know that for the FA now, educating footballers on pensions, investments, the future, putting money aside, tax, it's a big issue for them.
Well, no, I suppose when people think they have so much money, at the same time, with great money comes great responsibility, doesn't it? So if you've not had that education, then you stand to lose more in many ways.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, where you're talking before about you sort of inferring about people sort of targeting a vulnerable group, where there's lots of money, unfortunately, it's going to attract unscrupulous people, isn't it? Sure. And you hear some horror stories about some unregulated investment decisions that people have made and whatnot. Now, on the flip side of we mentioned the FCA before about how it's regulated and the regulatory side of it's quite intensive. I think it's right, because if you just look at that sort of demographic, the footballers, traditionally they have been targeted. Some of them have lost out, and they should be protected. And it just one group of people there shows that the regulatory side of it and education is vital.
No, well put.
There's some horror stories.
I can imagine. It's suppose there's never one group of people, no matter how rich, no matter how not rich, that aren't vulnerable in some capacity if they're not properly educated financially, and of the pros and cons of life. I suppose if you've not had that proper, look down all possible avenues, then anyone's, I suppose, vulnerable and at risk to a point. With you, Nick, I mean, you've done so much, you still plan to do so much. If you were to say what your plans are until the end of the year, have you got any short-term ambitions in crazy COVID land?
Well, I've obviously I see you at we share a. I'm still sharing. I see you in the office in Lancashire, one end of Lancashire, but I'm saying quite new, obviously, in terms of cross-qualifying, in terms of the financial world. I'm still just easing my way in. So towards the end of the year, now COVID is hopefully easing off, and we're coming out the other end of the pandemic, fingers crossed. My aim to the end of the year is sort of just go and just network and go and see my network. I haven't seen some of them for a long time. So I'm very friendly and know lots of solicitors, barristers, and that's my aim, really. Just go and see people. I'm quite happy in my own company, but even for me, I think this last 18 months, I'm ready to get out there and see people, I'm being honest. So that's my plan, just to get out there and hopefully sort of everything will just take care of itself. What about you?
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, similar to me. I'm going back to Lancaster this weekend. When I say this weekend, it won't be the weekend this goes out probably. So it can be, it can be. I'm going back every weekend. But now I'm going back this weekend. First time I've been back in over a year and a half. So that'll be fantastic. Be really good. Now that everything's opening up, hopefully, as I say, we look back on this discussion and we say, you know what, this was towards the start of when everything opened up, as opposed to, oh, look, that's when everything opened up before we went into a third lockdown. So hopefully, fingers crossed, it's onwards and upwards from here. Absolute pleasure talking to you as well, Nick.
And I also think we mentioned, didn't we, last week, that we're both intending to, it's a little bit ironic being on Zoom, but just cut down the technology a little bit and read plenty of books. That's what I'm.
Yeah, I do hope to get a bit more reading done, to be fair. I'm quite busy like yourself. It can be quite difficult to find. A good autobiography to follow Zlatan Ibrahimovic's would be something that I'd have up on my to read list, shall we say. But as I say, fantastic talking to you, Nick. Thanks for sparing some time. Thanks for telling the person kindly to go and make you a brew while this was going on. But been smashing pleasure, a lot of insight there, and wish you all the best with your ambitions this year and beyond.
You too. Thank you very much.
Well, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and enjoy the rest of your week.